Hello, and welcome to Scandinavia House online and to this webinar with writer and artist Kendra Greene, as we discuss her book, Museums of Wales You'll Never See, and the Other Excursions to Iceland's Most Unusual Museums, published by Penguin. I have a link to where you can purchase the book in the chat box, so please click that. And it gives you multiple choices if you want to buy a book, ebook, or audiobook. I also would like to wish everyone a happy International Museums Day. It is a great pleasure to having this talk here as we adapt to this new technology. And just on a side note, Scandinavia House is coming up with new programming daily, and we're just adding everything to the website. So please visit scandinavias.org for more information. I know there'll be more lectures coming up. There'll be a film screening. There'll be some concerts. So please visit the website. Kendra Greene is a writer and artist who has worked at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, the Chicago History Museum, the University of Iowa Museum of Natural History, and the Dallas Museum of Art, where she was a writer in residence. She has an MFA in nonfiction and a graduate certificate in book arts from the University of Iowa, and has been a recipient of the Fulbright Grant, a Jacob J. Javits Fellowship, and a Harvard Library Innovation Lab Fellowship. She lives in Dallas, where she is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Texas, a guest artist at the Nasher Sculpture Center, and associate editor of the Southwest Review. Welcome, Kendra.
It is a pleasure to be here, Kyle. Happy International Museum Day.
Happy International Museums Day to you. Thank you so much for your book. I figured, why don't we start off with a short reading from it so people can get in the right mood.
Fair enough. Already, right, I've had this book for a week, and one of my favorite things about it is a handmade bookmark that goes in it. The importance of ephemera and things worth holding on to. It happens around us all the time. So if any of you happen to be playing along, we are on page 94, and the illustration is what I'm going to be reading about. To collect stuffed birds is not such a rare thing in Iceland. The taxidermied skins, the birds after death, are a kind of species unto themselves, each adapted to its niche. There are the retail display birds, the restaurant decoration birds, a whole branch of various domestic, aesthetic, home decor birds on walls and shelves and coffee tables. Indeed, there is a certain practice in Iceland of making a display of one's home window. Not everyone does it, and it's only ever one window of a home, a single stage. But there, some combination of taxidermy, or shells, or figurines, or fake flowers in a little vase. Not a lot of things, not like storage, not the windowsill subbing as a bookshelf. No, just a few things, a spare kind of diorama, just a pair of black Converse shoes and a puffin posed on a rock. And note in these cases, everything faces the street. The curtain is pulled so the passing viewer can see no further into the life of this household than the windowsill tableau. The makers and any evidence of their daily lives are separated from their work. Maybe the windows act as landmarks. I think of these glimpses as a kind of charity, gifts to passersby. And maybe what's cast as centerpiece is a skull or a doll or a stuffed fox, but most likely, it's a bird.
Thank you very much. I always like to start at the beginning. There's always the beginning of the book. So can you tell us the story behind why you decided to write this book about all these small, obscure Icelandic museums that the majority of people, and probably even Icelanders, don't know about?
I think actually a lot about beginnings. It was always a thing that I would ask when I was researching in Iceland. And we know like the first thing that goes into a collection. We know when collections begin. And museums, it's hazy. No one can ever really pinpoint it. And I'm starting to feel like the book is sort of that way too. So I can tell you the story about how I was in grad school and there was a travel grant to leave the country, and you could have $2,000 to do it. That's what made me first look at one museum in Iceland. But once I was there and trying to put it in context, trying to figure out how you have a nation that makes the Icelandic Phallological Museum, I noticed that I went to maybe 20 more museums, and everything had been founded within basically the last 20 years, maybe the last 10 or 15. And so many of them, I started counting them up, and there were just way more museums than anywhere I'd ever been. And the way that they moved from private collections into public museums, right? I've lived in Chile and Korea and Greece, and I'd just never seen anything like it.
And why did you decide to write a book about it?
Yeah, so I went there thinking maybe there was an essay. I was looking at this museum that gets written up for being kooky and oddball and wacky. And when I started thinking about it, it was really strikingly traditional, right? Almost Victorian, which is a strange thing. You don't associate a prudishness with a phallological museum. But if you think about the individual collector, the amateur naturalist, without them, we lose most of the history of museums. And like I said, once I got there and was looking at just one collection, how it had become a museum, I couldn't figure out, I was just astonished that there was this bloom, right? That it was like Iceland had this compressed ability to start making museums, and pretty uniformly great museums, right? Amazing attention to detail and stagecraft, right? These very sharp niche collecting focuses. And not only were they making these museums, they seemed to be in this like hyper evolution that we were seeing how collections became museums, and almost as quickly museums that stopped needing things, right? That you could have the Sea Monster Museum, the Icelandic Museum of Sorcery and Witchcraft, the Museum of Prophecy is a place you can visit in Iceland. And what were they going to show you?
And how did you find out about these museums, and what kind of research did you do into the museums?
It's interesting. It actually ends up being a variety of sources. The first museum was because I was talking to a friend about how I couldn't come up with an idea to apply for this travel grant. And when I got home, she knew I had a background in museums, that I'd been writing about them, that from my time at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, managing their collection, I'd just been stunned that museums are storytelling institutions, but we don't tell our own stories, right? We are so focused on projecting a story out that these other stories, right, of trying to hold on to things, of interacting with the public, of what it is for someone to throw up in the galleries, of what it is for a certain corridor to be kind of a wind tunnel so that if you aren't careful, the painting will lift from your hand. We didn't tell these stories. And I was thinking about them a lot, about the backroom stories. And a friend sent me a list, I assume the first Google search result, of museum and world. And it was this list of the wackiest museums in the world. And I wouldn't have clicked on the Icelandic Phallological Museum, except I'd met one Icelander. And when I asked him what we should know about his country, the only thing, right, he could have talked about this astounding literacy rate, right? He could have talked about the Northern Lights. He could have talked about Bjork and Sigur Rós. He could have talked about, not quite at that point, the handball team hadn't taken silver at the Olympics yet, but there was a lot he could say. And he told me about one museum. So I started thinking about, I looked at that museum, and since then, right, I always ask Icelanders where there's a collection that might be about to be a museum, where I should go. So a lot of it are recommendations in country. I love arriving at the airport and picking up that year's annual museum guide. I was on a research trip in 2015 when I flipped it open to see if there were anything new, to write to count up, to see if we were continuing to expand. And I realized there was a museum of nonsense. And I thought, well, you can't miss that, right? Nothing with that good of a name should be missed. And from there, right, people would point me to things I should know about. And I would just assume that if I was traveling through anywhere, I should stop and look.
Nice. And I guess I need to ask, what drew you to Iceland in the first place?
I was not one of those clever people who had it on their bucket list from the beginning. I've since learned an awful lot of people do, and I've been delighted. I started going in 2011 and have gone back most years since. And in the intervening time, basically anyone that has a friend or any friend of mine that is going, right, we end up in a conversation about how to pack and what they should see and what not to miss, and the importance of, if you can get invited to someone's home to have pancakes or waffles with fresh rhubarb jam, you should definitely do that. But I was thinking first about museums, and then I ended up in Iceland. And once I was in Iceland, it was easy to know I should keep going back.
What were a few of your most interesting discoveries, and which of the museums surprised you the most?
This is a good question, right? There are so many museums. It's in fact also hard to count museums in Iceland. There are 45 accredited museums, but if you talk to the local museum studies professor, his 2014 Excel spreadsheet puts it at 265 museums and public collections and exhibitions and centers. And I think the number has only been going up since then. So things that surprised me, when I heard about the Icelandic Sea Monster Museum, I thought that sounded amazing, and was thinking a lot about the way that Icelanders figure out ways to display the things that can't be seen. And this seemed like it might have a lot to tell me about that, which it does, but it's also the only oral history museum I've ever been to, right? 4,000 stories of personal encounters with things that can't be explained, right? That was really surprising.
Oh, and what were some of the things you learned about Iceland in the process of visiting these museums?
Oh, goodness. Well, I feel like I definitely learned about Icelandic hospitality. A certain amount of researching museums is sitting in the foyer, drinking coffee, having soup. And right, since so many of these places are family affairs, there's a good chance that someone related to the original collector, if not the collector or original curator themselves, is the person to bring you your coffee, is the person serving you a cake made from their grandmother's recipe. Some of my favorite things are the things in the language. The Skóar Folk Museum is especially good for this. I learned about a gift underfoot being an idiom and relating to these inserts that are knit and made as a courting gift from a woman to a man, and important if you live in a place where everybody's shoes are these sort of low slipper-like things, caked in mud from walking to church, and the easiest way to find your shoes is based on the little bit of cushion and love that's inside of them.
Do you think being a smaller population country helps with this unique personal connection with the museums and its viewership, or not?
I think absolutely. One of the things about a country as small as Iceland is that it tends towards the superlative, right, to the extreme in a hurry, right? There's just not that much data to shift.
Right.
But if we think that the original curator of the second museum in Iceland is still alive, right? Thordur is 99. I think he turned 99 in April, and working on, I believe, his 29th book, and only retired a few years ago from the museum. Right, these are things that have happened relatively recently in Icelandic history. And right, this was a man who, he was the experience as much as the museum, right? 15,000 objects from a lifetime of collecting, but you went because you'd walk in and Thordur would recognize your nose and know who you were related to, who would talk to you for a little while, and come back with a phone because he'd put it together that you had a cousin you didn't know about 2 fjords over, and now here they are, seeing if you want to have coffee.
Do you think these museums exist in the US? These smaller, I mean, they have to. I mean, and maybe not in the big cities, but they probably exist in New York City as well. Yeah. I didn't have any advice of how to seek these out.
What a good question. Yeah, I have a very complicated relationship with words like oddball and wacky, right? That often come attached to tiny museums.
Yeah.
As I was looking at museums in Iceland, there's just so many of them are so small, right? They're museums that fit in towns of 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000 people. Right, the Museum of Nonsense is only one of 5 museums in a town of 201 people up in the Vestfjords. And I think I started thinking that there were so many, they'd happened so fast. I was prepared to meet tourist traps. I think that's sort of the US version of this. And I just never did, right? That the care and attention and the beauty and the pride were always there. I think in looking in the US, I think they get dispersed. I think there are so many things that are bigger that they can be easy to miss. But we also have a tradition of the house museum, right? There was a couple in DC who ran a squished penny museum, right? Those novelties where you put in 2 quarters and you crank and you pick your design and it squishes the penny. There's a Kazoo museum in South Carolina that started as a living room museum in Portland, Oregon. So it's a thing we do too, but I think we're also disadvantaged because, like I said, when I first got to Iceland, I just couldn't get over it. It was amazing to me, this move from private collection to public museum. And at some point I realized it's already in the language, right? That Icelandic doesn't make a differentiation, right? Both things are sap. And I think maybe in places that have words for each thing, right? Certainly the US doesn't just speak English. I think getting over the barrier of language might actually make it harder for us.
Thank you. And what are some of the things that you have learned about Iceland in the process of visiting these museums as well?
Yeah, well, in terms of research, I've learned to stay in one place until it feels like I've stayed too long, right? That waiting for something to happen has a lot of value. Showing up until somebody remembers something that they think you should know is where a lot of the magic lies. I mean, I've also learned how you would take the intestine of a sheep and look at its contents to predict the rest of the winter, right? Where you're going to have the hard days and where the nicer patches of weather are going to come through. I think a lot about the immigration center up in Hofsós and the story of a woman who left Iceland for Brazil and on her deathbed could no longer speak Icelandic because she'd been in such a rush to let go of a life that had been really hard. I can keep going. It's a long list. Right? I've learned that there are sea anemones that look like woven baskets that only exist 500 meters beneath the surface of the ocean.
Oh, yeah. What's under the ocean is crazy. Has writing the book changed the way you look at museum collecting and curating? If so, how?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot of just defining museums, a thing that I kept meeting in this book, and places where I would talk to Icelandic museum professionals and say, are you watching what's happening? This move from collections becoming museums, and museums that are so focused on story, they don't have things they could show you. Right? This is amazing, this shift that I think was always possible for any museum, but the attention from the thing to the story, isn't it incredible? And the stopping of, well, the place you just mentioned is an exhibition or a center or a thing that's a little bit different. I've had a lot of conversations thinking about who collectors are and why they collect, and whether it's possible that it's not the thing you think they're collecting that is really the point of their passion, that it is the amassing, right? It is the owning, it is the hunting, it is the finding, it is the caretaking, right? It is the documenting and the labeling and the providing context. So I think in a lot of ways, my ideas of what a museum is and what it can do keep being expanded. And I'm really interested to see, right, as we enter an age where I think more and more of us just have enough stuff that we can understand how keeping a collection is hard and what that means. I think our relationship with museums and where museums put their energy in terms of the stories they need to tell, the people they need to connect with, and the things that exist in the world and need to be taken care of. I think we're going to see really interesting shifts there.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience, and if you have any questions for those listening, please write them in the chat and I will get to them. The first question comes from Lisa. Of all the things you saw in the Icelandic collections, which object filled you with sadness and which object filled you with joy?
I almost feel like they're often the same objects, right? I'm thinking about this pair of heron legs, right? So that right, the legs of a bird that are part of a sort of magical thinking tradition. That if you if you get them in the right way and you hold on to them, they will protect your sailors when they go out to sea and come back. Indeed, right, you might have the foot of the heron tucked under your own shoe, with the idea that when you get overfished, the claw will sting you, right? There's an idiom that lives on, right? Roughly, to give good claw is to be a good provider. So that's the thing that, right, the chance to see a way of thinking, right, to try to imagine the context in which this would be a really reasonable thing to do, right? Having access to that is totally joyous, and thinking about right, the danger, right, the difficulty that people were encountering. There's a museum on the East Coast, the French Fishermen in Iceland Museum, and they've got a memorial to all of the French fishermen that were lost in Icelandic waters. And I think it's, again, sort of these twin moments of the shocking revelation, right? The delight in having an illuminating piece of information, and also the great sadness. I keep thinking about the museum tells us that the women who married the French fishermen before they came to fish in Iceland were known as the Widows of Iceland before their husbands even died, because it was just such a dangerous job.
So these museums are maintaining the oral Icelandic traditions. These, as I know the threat of the Icelandic language. There's always a threat to the Icelandic language. English taking over. Kids are learning English earlier and earlier. But so these museums are also helping preserve, what it means to be Icelandic as well, which is very interesting.
Well, I think the language is so tied to it, right? That Iceland put a lot of cultural energy for a long time into, right, the poems, the sagas, the language, the stories, the literacy that we see in Iceland in the 16th century, right? It starts early, right? It is a clear place that we are investing. I think about the director of the Immigration Center says, the Icelanders, when they left, would have the heaviest trunks because they packed them with books. You don't feel starving or in pain if you have a book.
This question is from, one second while I go up. Oops. I'll get to it next. This is from Annie. How does the museum travel help with storytelling, either nonfiction or fiction, in your experience?
Well, I sort of love that. So I started out at this one Icelandic museum. The last summer, it was under the original curator up in Husavik, and it's a long thing to spend the 3 months sitting every day at your museum. And so his children would come and spell him. And one of his children who came is the writer Lilia Sigurdóttir. She's a noir writer who is a delightful human being and a fantastic writer. And I feel so lucky. I met her just as each of our books were beginning. And so one of my earliest guides to Iceland was a novelist, right, pointing me to places that have been picking the best stories. So I feel like it was really lucky and really joyful work, and I recommend anyone to try to do the same thing.
This question is from Oswaldo. Do museums in Iceland get financial assistance from the government, and is there an official institution that supervises them?
Yeah, there is an official institution that governs accreditation, right? The 45 accredited Icelandic museums, and it does most of the financial aid that can be offered. Any museum director will tell you that it helps. They're thankful for everything they can get, but it's never enough to float them on its own, right? There's not enough grants. It's always going to be a matter of people coming in.
Okay. And this is a question from Sally. Museums are beginning to rethink and how to reimagine themselves post-COVID-19. Is there anything that we can learn from the Icelandic museums that will contribute to this conversation?
Thank you for asking that question. I think one of the strong things that I see in the Icelandic museums are their commitments to storytelling. And I think as we are getting to a place where we can see representations of the object, but not commune with the object itself, right, where it'll be easier to read and access videos, but maybe not have a guide or a docent all to ourselves. I think how you tell the story is really important.
And this is another question. Who goes to all of these museums? Or is it locals?
I think about a moment where I was sitting at Lake Mivat in Sigurgur's Bird Museum, and there was this family from DC, and one of them had gone in to see the actual exhibition, and the rest of us were out having coffee and cake. And this family was asking me what I was up to, and they were getting interested, and they said, "Oh my!" And they seemed very engaged with the project. They had all sorts of questions, and one of the questions was, "But who goes to museums in Iceland?" And I thought, we're in a museum in Iceland. So this is a good question that I've had some time to sit with. By the numbers, most museums in Iceland where I was keeping track, if they're keeping track, they've got people coming from around the world, right? From North America, from Europe, from Asia. Right. The Icelanders are more likely to visit on Sundays, right? Just as a cultural thing, that's the day you go out and do things. And there are places like the Icelandic Museum of Sorcery and Witchcraft, where it is free for children under 14. So all the kids of the town have the run of the place if they want it. And I think it's a good question, right? Who visits the museum, and in some ways, who it benefits, right? Like I say, I've been doing this research since 2011, and I've never met an Icelander who says that this is for profit, for tourists. That the point is often this idea of wanting to do something for the town, either a town that has suffered an economic hardship, or a place that needs a sense of identity, right? Needs a thing to bring it back together.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, the last question here, unless there's more questions, please do write in the chat. Did you learn Icelandic as a result of your explorations?
Well, you can't help but learn parts of Icelandic. I feel like, especially traveling, the geography is so regularly named that you go to Dettifoss and Skogafoss, and then you think, wait a minute, all these waterfalls are fosses, right? All of these viks are harbors, all of these dollars are valleys. So I've been improving my Icelandic, but I wouldn't want to rely on it.
That also brings me up to a point. On our website, we had an exhibition called Saga Sites a couple of years ago, and we just made a virtual exhibition of that museum. And what the Saga Sites is an 18th or 19th century Victorian explorer, Collingwood, went to Iceland because he was curious about the sites that were discussed in the sagas, but he didn't know what these sites looked like. So he went himself to and he made watercolors. And then 100 years later, an Icelandic photographer followed in Collingwood's footsteps and took photographs of them. So you could see the old watercolors compared to the new photography. And that is on our website at scandinavias.org if you are interested in looking at that exhibition. Oh, one last question from Herta. What comes next, and what kind of projects are you currently working on? And has the time of crisis affected your ways of working?
I appreciate the question. My interest in collections is expanding a little bit as I think about libraries, archives, and museums. The Germans give us this term Giftschrank, which literally means poison cabinet. So it's a thing that you encounter at the chemists or the pharmacists, but it's also a place in the library. And I love this idea of the Giftschrank, the poison cabinet, to talk about the things that we hold on to that are dangerous, right? Things that make us afraid, things that are literally toxic, things that are ideologically concerning, and how we hold on to things that we know are dangerous. We make a point of keeping dangerous things because we know how much more dangerous it is to let them go, to censor, to forget, to deny them. So there's that. Obviously, the traveling to these places looks a lot different for the foreseeable future. But in some ways, it's really interesting to me to be writing about dangerous objects that, like, sure, there's there's arsenic, right? There are things that will explode. There's mercury, there's red rot. There's stuff you do not want to be near. But a lot of what makes things dangerous, in fact, maybe most of what makes things dangerous, is the fact that we fear it, right? That we fear some eventual harm that will come. So there might be things I didn't want to be near anyhow. And the thing I think I'm actually interested in, the object gets me the story, the object gets me there, but it's the story I need access to, not the thing.
Well, what's so nice about your book and with your beautiful language, you don't need to visit these museums. You can visit them within your mind with your beautiful language. I really do appreciate. I felt like I was actually there, and the stories behind the museums themselves. It's a wonderful read. I highly do recommend it. But at this point, I would like to try something fun. If there's families in the audience or kids, we were considering about making a museum at the home, since most of our museums are closed at the moment. But there's so many objects that we have in our everyday household, and I was hoping that Kendra could help, sort of go through the process of making a home museum. I have some objects here. I know Kendra has some objects, so I don't know if you would like to start.
I would love to. First, I want to give you the behind the scenes official museum directives. Someone that was a preparator and really loved the work of having the museum ready, the exhibition ready. I want to remind you the importance of keeping a little tiny Tupperware of your paint and a foam brush to just go and do touch-ups every Saturday before you open your museum. I was going to tell you one of my favorite tricks. I can't believe this is an actual thing museums do, but it is. So this is a Sharpie. This is a test print a photographer used as a thank you note to me that I subsequently framed when I was at the photography museum. It's in a black channel frame. They're reusable. We use them all the time. You see where it's they're showing a little bit of silver from the metal? You can do touch-ups with a Sharpie, actual museum technique. And of course, a key to your museum is going to be thinking about the story that you want to tell. I've noticed there are a lot of places that have been thinking more about windows lately, and you might want to join them, right? I think my nieces just hosted a drive-by safari by making bottle fish for their windows that people could come see. I know there've been scavenger hunts for shamrocks and Easter egg hunts. So this might be a time to think about the gift that you want to be giving to the people walking by. I want to show you Glitter Lizard, who is actually a candle. Glitter Lizard should probably not live in the window. Fruit is probably going to spoil, but most things are probably going to be in very good shape. I also want to remind you that you have maybe more options for if you need to put things on the wall. I'm a letterpress printer, and our standard are binder clips. We don't frame very much. We mostly put them in binder clips, and I'm a big fan of the T-pin. I think it's a very elegant solution. Also, right, you've got tape. This is washi tape. Loops to put things on the wall help, and glue dots are available at craft stores. I used them in a museum exhibition, a gallery exhibition this time last year. Don't eat them, they look like gumdrops. So, like I say, I think part of the key is the story you want to tell. I brought you two different dinosaurs as an example today. This is a dinosaur that I sewed. I could tell you stories about each of the different pieces of felt in it. I could tell you about deciding to add a tongue that was not part of the original pattern. And you can imagine it if we just think of things that are similar, living with this dinosaur. And yet their stories are so different. This is a much, much older dinosaur. It is made, it's a plastic injection, right? You put in your quarters and turn the crank. This is a dinosaur from the World's Fair. So with this, we can talk about the kid who got it. I happen to know him. He's not a kid anymore. right? We can talk about that particular trip. We can talk about that fair. We can talk about plastics and novelties and souvenirs. With this, we can talk about, right, stitching and fabric and, right, the friends that I send them to. They can definitely live together, but they potentially have very different stories to tell. Kyle, I was wondering if you would show us what's in your museum.
All right. Well, these are all, what's in my museum are things that I know who created them. So, you know, there's so much mass-produced stuff out there, and a lot of the tourist trinkets one gets, you don't know who made it. It's maybe even made not in the country that you're visiting. So I wanted to choose things that I know, at least I don't know them personally, but I know I met the person making these objects. So I have 4 objects. Sorry. 3 paintings and 2 sculptures. This is a Sami water cup. Drinking vessel. The Samis would tie to their belts and drink water out of it. This is from an artist called Stephen Keane, whose philosophy was he wants art to be like buying a CD. So he produces mass-produced art like this for like $10 or $5. And I bought this and I got a record with it as well. So I really saved on the deal. This came from a trip in Nicaragua, and I saw the lady painting it. It was one from the tourist stalls, but I saw the lady making it, so I thought that was very interesting. This is a painting that I got on my 40th birthday from my friend Bishak. It's a drawing of Lemmy from Motorhead with a koala bear. I'm not sure why he made it, or she made it, but yeah, I do like it quite a bit. And this is a sculpture that I got, I think in Grenada. I just like the idea of you go to these tourist places, but there's people still doing business. Yeah, there. And I just like the idea that he's dressed all up, you know, and it's a tropical setting. So that is my little museum.
I think, well, one, Kyle, thank you for showing us. Those are so lovely. And right, you notice how you can't help but tell us the story, right? You don't focus on the year they were made, the material they were made out of, right? You didn't foreground the artist's name so that we would know that first and foremost. You didn't put them in their art historical context. All of that information is valid. I feel like it's sort of like the Aristotelian causes. Well, right, we can think about, right, the formal cause, the material cause, the proximate cause, but and they all matter, right? They all tell us something about this thing and how it got there. But then there's also this way in which the thing is a touchstone and gets us all of the memory, right? There are definitely things, you might be the same way, that I can't let go of because I don't think I'd remember that day again, right? I would lose so much more than, right, the object itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess on that note, thank you so much, Kendra, for joining us.
It has been such a pleasure to be with you, Kyle. Thank you especially for showing us your home treasures.
My pleasure.
And Kyle, if you feel like they need to be a little more museumy, remember you can always add wall text.
Yes, yes. Yeah, yeah. And or I can hang them on walls too. But yeah. Yeah. So, but please do go out and purchase the book. The link is in the chat. I can put it one more time so it's refreshed. Yeah, and I do highly recommend the book. It's really fascinating, and I believe Iceland is opening up to tourists in mid-June. I know there's a lot of stipulations with the opening up, but I think the country is going to be welcoming tourists again very soon. So hopefully you can visit some of these museums in the future. Thank you.
Will you remind us what else we should be tuning into soon at Scandinavia House?
Yes, I'm still working on it. So we should have, it should be up very shortly. And we do send out a weekly newsletter on Fridays. We will be having a screening of The Painter and the Thief. The winner of, it won Sundance this year, the Sundance Film Festival, as Best World Documentary. We'll have a link to that on our website on Friday. We will be also exploring how the Nordic countries are dealing with the COVID virus, hopefully with talks from Norway, Finland, and Denmark. We are working on some concerts, so we're working on some midsummer celebrations, so we have a lot coming up.
And Kyle, one last thing I noticed in the chat, Herta has a great question. Is there a Scanhouse hashtag for audiences to share their stories and museums with other viewers?
Oh, yes, we should make one. How about hashtag, what do we say, museums? Oh, we have on hashtag Scanhouse. So yeah, just put that on. My cat is going crazy right now. So yeah, so it's hashtag at Scanhouse, and tag us at any time. And if you want to share your museums at home with us, please do take a photo and use that hashtag.
Oh my goodness, Kyle, it has been such a pleasure. Thank you for this afternoon.
Thank you. And thank you for coming, panelists, and hope to see you soon in real life as well. So, okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.